Every single day, more than 10 million barrels of oil head straight for China. That's enough to fill over 600 Olympic-sized swimming pools, flowing across the seas around the clock without stopping for a second. And almost all of that lifeblood has to pass through one incredibly narrow gap in the ocean. That gap is the Strait of Malacca, a slim waterway squeezed between Malaysia and Indonesia's island of Sumatra. At its narrowest point, it measures just 2.7 kilometers across. That's shorter than many people's morning run, yet some of the world's most valuable cargo passes through this route every single day. This tiny corridor helps keep China's factories humming, its skylines glowing, and its economy charging ahead. The United States Navy operates in these waters on a regular basis, and that's where things get serious. China depends heavily on this route, but it has no control over it, not even close. For a country that needs this much energy, that's a major strategic weakness, so China made a bold move. It poured roughly $7 billion into a massive pipeline, running through another country, cutting across thick jungles and rugged mountains to move oil while avoiding the Malacca bottleneck altogether. If you enjoy stories like this, hit like and subscribe. This is the story of how that pipeline was built, why it matters, and what this narrow passage reveals about the lengths nations will go to protect what keeps them running. At first glance, the Strait of Malacca looks like just another shipping lane, but calling it just a shipping lane is like calling the internet just a bunch of cables, technically true but wildly understating its importance. What passes through this narrow corridor helps power industries, sustain supply chains, and shape the economies of an entire continent. Roughly 1/3 of all global trade moves through the Strait of Malacca every year. That alone is staggering, but for China, the stakes have been even higher. At one point, nearly 80% of China's imported oil traveled through this single route. Think about that for a second. 80% of the energy feeding the world's second largest economy was squeezed through a passage barely wider than a small town. On any given day, dozens of giant supertankers move through these waters in both directions. Some of these vessels are so enormous that they stretch longer than 4 Empire State Buildings lined up end to end, and yet they all have to share a route that offers very little room for error. One wrong move, one unexpected delay, and traffic can back up fast. Maritime experts have long described this as one of the most difficult and high-pressure waterways to manage anywhere on Earth, and the strategic pressure is just as intense. A serious accident, a geopolitical standoff, or even severe congestion could disrupt the flow of oil and goods almost overnight. The consequences for China could be enormous. Factories could slow down, supply chains could seize up, and fuel prices could jump sharply across the country. And because China manufactures so many products for the rest of the world, the impact would not stop there. Global markets could feel the shock almost immediately. This vulnerability has worried analysts and policymakers for decades. It became so significant that it earned a name that still echoes in strategic circles today: the Malacca Dilemma. The problem was simple to explain but incredibly hard to solve. China depended on the Strait of Malacca, yet China had no way to control what happened there. The United States Navy maintained a strong presence in the region. Neighboring countries had their own priorities and alliances, and Singapore, one of the busiest port hubs on the planet, sat at the southern entrance with close ties to Western partners. That left China in a tense position. It was the biggest customer using this route, but someone else effectively controlled the only doorway, and the countries surrounding that doorway had every reason to protect their own interests first. For years, China accepted this risk because its economy was expanding so quickly that other issues seemed more urgent. But the pressure kept building. China's appetite for oil grew larger every year. At the same time, regional tensions became more pronounced throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Depending so heavily on one narrow waterway started to look like a dangerous gamble. Chinese engineers, diplomats, and energy planners began asking a bold question: what if the oil never had to pass through the Strait of Malacca at all? That question sparked one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects of the 21st century. The solution sounded surprisingly direct. If the sea route could not be secured, then a new land route had to be built. The plan was massive. Oil tankers from the Middle East and Africa would sail to a port on Myanmar's western coast, bypassing the Strait of Malacca entirely. There, the oil would be unloaded and pumped through a pipeline stretching overland into China. The port selected for this mission was Kiautpu, located on the Bay of Bengal. Huge tankers arrive there and transfer their cargo into giant storage facilities linked directly to the pipeline system. From that point, the oil begins a long journey northeast. The pipeline cuts across Myanmar's rugged terrain, climbs through remote regions, crosses the border into China's Yunnan province, and ultimately reaches Kunming. The stretch through Myanmar alone runs for roughly 770 kilometers. It was an enormous undertaking designed to solve one of China's biggest strategic vulnerabilities. Once China's domestic pipeline network is included, the entire system stretches more than 2,500 kilometers. That's roughly like driving from Mumbai to Delhi and back, with plenty of distance left over. This was not a small shortcut. It was a massive energy lifeline built to reduce one of China's biggest strategic risks. In fact, two major pipelines run side by side along this route. One carries crude oil and began operating in 2017. The other transports natural gas and has been in service since 2013. Together, they form the China-Myanmar Energy Corridor, a huge infrastructure project built and operated primarily by China National Petroleum Corporation, one of the largest energy companies in the world. The oil pipeline can move about 440,000 barrels of crude per day at full capacity. The gas pipeline can carry around 12 billion cubic meters each year. Those are enormous figures. They are not enough to replace all of China's imported energy, but they are more than enough to ease pressure on the Strait of Malacca and give Beijing a valuable alternative route. What makes this project even more impressive is what it took to build it. This was far more complicated than digging a trench and laying steel pipes underground. Before a single pipe section could be installed, construction teams had to overcome a long list of obstacles that had nothing to do with pipelines themselves. In many parts of Myanmar, the terrain was so isolated that no roads existed for heavy machinery. Crews first had to build access roads from scratch, cutting through dense forests and carving paths along steep hillsides before the real construction work could even begin. Building access roads was only the beginning. In some sections, that work alone took months before pipeline construction could even start. Then came the geography. The route crosses multiple rivers, including wide and fast-moving waterways that required specialized engineering. It climbs into highland regions where temperatures can drop sharply compared with the humid coast, and it passes through areas where the soil changes dramatically over short distances, forcing engineers to constantly adjust how the pipeline was anchored, insulated, and protected underground. That meant there was no one-size-fits-all solution. Engineers had to develop custom designs for dozens of terrain types along one continuous route. Dense forest, unstable slopes, rocky ground, river crossings, each challenge demanded a different approach. Keeping oil and gas moving smoothly over such a long distance created another major hurdle. Pressure had to remain carefully balanced from one end of the system to the other. If pressure fell too much, the flow would slow and become inefficient. If pressure rose too quickly, it could put dangerous stress on joints and wells. To solve this, pumping stations were installed at regular intervals along the corridor. Each station was precisely calibrated to maintain the right speed and pressure, regardless of changing elevation, temperature, or terrain conditions. It was a highly coordinated system working non-stop behind the scenes. That is why the $7 billion price tag starts to make sense. Once you look at the engineering complexity, the cost reflects the sheer scale of what had to be built. But the real question is what this project changed in practice. And the answer is more dramatic than many people realize. Under the old system, an oil tanker leaving the Persian Gulf would cross the Indian Ocean, pass through the Strait of Malacca, enter the South China Sea, and continue to ports on China's eastern coast. Depending on the route, that voyage could stretch roughly 12,000 to 13,000 kilometers through some of the most strategically monitored waters in the world. With the Myanmar pipeline, the same tanker still crosses the Indian Ocean, but instead of continuing through the Malacca bottleneck, it stops at Kyaukpyu. From there, the oil is unloaded and sent overland directly toward China, cutting out one of the most vulnerable links in the entire journey. At Kyaukpyu, the sea journey ends. The oil is pumped directly into the pipeline and sent overland into China. That means China's southwestern region can receive fuel without the tanker ever passing through the Strait of Malacca, and that changes the equation in a big way. The shipping route is shortened by several thousand kilometers, tankers spend less time at sea, voyage costs are reduced, and a critical vulnerability is avoided entirely. Most importantly, the oil no longer depends on the narrow choke point that China does not control. To be clear, this pipeline does not carry the majority of China's oil imports. Most of China's energy still arrives through traditional maritime routes, and a significant share continues to pass through the Strait of Malacca. But that does not make this project insignificant, not even close. On a strong day, the pipeline can account for less than 5% of China's total oil imports. That might sound modest at first, but the scale is enormous. If China imports around 10 million barrels per day, then 5% represents roughly 500,000 barrels taking a completely different route every single day. That is a huge amount of oil. And when the goal is to reduce dependence on one vulnerable corridor, every barrel moved through an alternative path makes the overall system more resilient and more difficult to disrupt. There's another major benefit that often gets overlooked. For decades, China's largest ports, refineries, and industrial centers were concentrated along the eastern coast. Cities like Shanghai, Tianjin, and Guangzhou. Energy typically arrived there first and then had to be transported inland, adding time and cost for western provinces. The Myanmar pipeline changes that dynamic for southwestern China. Yunnan province can now receive oil and natural gas directly from the west without waiting for shipments to land on the eastern seaboard and travel thousands of additional kilometers. That means lower transportation costs, faster deliveries, and stronger support for industries that require large amounts of energy. Regions that once faced logistical disadvantages now have a more direct connection to global energy supplies, giving southwestern China a much larger role in the country's economic development. This project did more than create a backup route. It also helped unlock the economic potential of southwestern China, a region that had long been less connected to global energy flows. One investment delivered two major advantages: stronger energy security and faster regional development. But the Myanmar pipeline is only one piece of a much bigger strategy. China did not build a single alternative route and stop there. It launched a broader effort across multiple continents to reduce its dependence on vulnerable maritime chokepoints. Look to the west. China developed one of the longest overland energy networks in the world, stretching from Turkmenistan through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan into China's Xinjiang region. These are the Central Asia-China gas pipelines. There are 3 main lines already in operation, and together they can transport around 55 billion cubic meters of natural gas each year. A 4th expansion has been planned and could push total capacity beyond 80 billion cubic meters annually. That is an enormous volume of energy flowing directly over land. To put that in perspective, 80 billion cubic meters of gas is enough to supply a tremendous amount of household and industrial energy. It highlights just how large this network has become. China also built a separate oil pipeline from Kazakhstan that stretches more than 2,200 kilometers into western China. No ocean crossings, no narrow maritime choke points, just a direct land connection carrying energy straight into the country. Now look north. The Power of Siberia pipeline links China with Russia. Extending more than 3,000 kilometers, it is designed to deliver up to 38 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year at full capacity. Gas deliveries began in 2019 and have increased steadily since then. A second project, commonly called Power of Siberia 2, is under development and could add another 50 billion cubic meters annually once completed. If fully realized, the energy connection between Russia and China would become one of the largest bilateral gas supply systems in the world. Taken together, these projects reveal a clear strategy: build multiple routes, spread the risk, and make China's energy system far more flexible and resilient. Now look to the southwest. China has invested heavily in Pakistan's Gwadar port as part of the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. The strategy mirrors what China pursued in Myanmar: bring energy and cargo to a western port by sea, then move it overland into China while reducing dependence on major maritime choke points. The distance from Gwadar to Xinjiang is more than 3,000 kilometers, and this is no ordinary route. It crosses some of the most difficult terrain on Earth, including the towering Karakoram Range, where many peaks rise above 7,000 meters. Building large-scale energy infrastructure in this environment is an enormous challenge. That is why this corridor is still evolving. The geography slows development, raises costs, and complicates construction. But the long-term vision remains clear: create another pathway that gives China more options and greater flexibility. Then there is the domestic network tying everything together. China has built more than 100,000 kilometers of internal oil and gas pipelines connecting coastal terminals, refineries, storage facilities, and major industrial zones across the country. This system functions like a national energy nervous system. When natural gas arrives from Central Asia, it can be routed east to manufacturing centers. When oil enters through Myanmar, it can be sent north or deeper inland. When imports surge at eastern ports, those supplies can be redistributed west to balance demand. The goal is adaptability. Energy can be redirected wherever it is needed most, helping China respond more quickly to market changes, regional shortages, or disruptions along any single route. The result is a dramatic transformation. China has moved from relying heavily on one critical maritime corridor to building a network of pipelines arriving from multiple directions, all feeding into one interconnected national system that can adjust in real time. But this strategy is not without serious challenges. Building the infrastructure is one thing, ensuring that every route operates smoothly under changing political and security conditions is another. The Myanmar pipeline is a powerful strategic tool, but it is far from perfect, and some of its biggest vulnerabilities have nothing to do with engineering. One major difference between pipelines and ships is flexibility. If a shipping lane becomes congested or risky, tankers can often be rerouted. A pipeline once built is fixed in place and far less adaptable. With a ship, the response can be simple. If a route becomes risky, the captain can change course and keep moving. The disruption may be inconvenient, but the cargo still reaches its destination. A pipeline works very differently. It follows one fixed path and cannot be rerouted. If the route is disrupted by physical damage, political tensions, or nearby conflict, the flow can slow or stop entirely. There is no quick detour and no backup lane built into the pipe itself. That is especially important in Myanmar, where the operating environment has become highly unstable. Since 2021, the country has faced significant internal conflict following a military takeover. Armed resistance groups control territory in several parts of the country, including areas near portions of the pipeline route. This creates a serious and ongoing vulnerability. The pipeline passes through a landscape where security conditions can change rapidly. Because the infrastructure is stationary and spread across hundreds of kilometers, protecting it requires constant coordination and dependable local cooperation, something that can be difficult to maintain over time. Commercial tensions have added another layer of uncertainty. China and Myanmar have faced disputes over pricing, revenue sharing, and operating terms. These disagreements have contributed to periods when the crude oil pipeline operated well below its maximum capacity. The system is designed to carry up to 440,000 barrels per day, but actual throughput has often been considerably lower. Building the pipeline was a major achievement. Keeping it fully utilized has proven far more complicated. Then there is the maintenance burden, which never disappears. Hundreds of kilometers of pipe crossing remote mountains and isolated terrain must be monitored continuously. Equipment has to be inspected, pressure levels must be tracked, and repairs must be made quickly whenever issues arise. The pipeline may offer China a strategic alternative, but it also demands constant attention to remain reliable. Pressure fluctuations, small leaks, corrosion at weld points, wear and tear at pumping stations. Every one of these issues has to be detected early. A minor fault in an easy-to-reach location is manageable. The same fault in a remote mountain section can become a major operational problem, especially when it takes a full day of off-road travel just to reach the site. So yes, the Myanmar pipeline helps China reduce its dependence on the Strait of Malacca, but it does not eliminate risk, it shifts the risk. Instead of relying on one maritime choke point, China must now manage political uncertainty, security concerns, and the possibility that disputes over pricing or operating terms could limit the flow of oil for extended periods. That is exactly why China never treated the Myanmar pipeline as a complete solution. From the beginning, it was designed as one layer in a much broader system of redundancy. The strategy is straightforward: diversify energy sources, build multiple delivery routes, and ensure that no single pipeline or shipping lane can disrupt the entire system. The Myanmar corridor is a significant piece of that strategy, but it is only one part of a far larger network, and that leads to the bigger story. Step back from the pipelines, the ports, and the multi-billion-dollar construction projects, and a deeper shift becomes clear. What we are really seeing is a major change in how China thinks about strategic risk and long-term security. For much of modern history, global energy trade operated on a simple assumption. Oil-producing countries extracted crude, shipping companies transported it across the oceans, and importing nations received it at their ports. The model depended on open sea lanes and the expectation that international trade routes would remain broadly accessible to all. For decades, that system worked well, but China began asking a critical question: how secure are those routes if they are protected by powerful navies and shaped by geopolitical realities beyond China's control? The Strait of Malacca sits in a region where the United States has maintained a military presence for decades, and that fact pushed China to rethink a core assumption of the global energy system and invest billions to build alternatives. In a major geopolitical crisis, the entire equation can change. A trade route that appears neutral in peacetime can quickly become a strategic pressure point when relations between countries deteriorate. That realization led China to make a decision that was simple in concept but enormous in execution. Instead of treating energy security as merely a shipping problem, China began treating it as a system design challenge. The question shifted from, how do we protect our ships on this route, to, how do we build a network where no single route is important enough to become a critical vulnerability? That is what the Myanmar pipeline represents when viewed in the broader context. It is more than a backup route, it is part of a larger strategic blueprint. The objective is to create a distributed system that is harder to disrupt. If one route is interrupted, others can help compensate. If pressure builds at one choke point, energy can continue arriving through alternative pathways. Does the system work perfectly? No. The risks in Myanmar are real. The Central Asia pipelines depend on relationships with countries that have their own political priorities and changing interests. The pipeline connections with Russia are tied to a complex international relationship that remains closely watched around the world, but those complications do not undermine the core strategy. In fact, they highlight its purpose. The goal was never to find one flawless route. The goal was to ensure that no single route, however important, could be used to place disproportionate pressure on China's economy. By that measure, China has significantly strengthened its position compared with where it stood 2 decades ago. The Strait of Malacca remains one of the busiest and most important trade corridors on Earth, carrying enormous volumes of global commerce every day, but it is no longer the only door. And once a country has multiple doors, the strategic influence of any single choke point is dramatically reduced. That is the real significance of China's $7 billion move to bypass the Malacca bottleneck. China once sent nearly 80% of its imported oil through a 2.7-kilometer wide passage it did not control. Today it has built a vast network of pipelines reaching in from the west, the north, and the southwest, all feeding into one massive interconnected energy system. That is a stunning transformation driven by decades of planning, billions of dollars in investment, and engineering work across some of the toughest terrain on Earth. The Myanmar pipeline is just one chapter in this story, but what a chapter it is. The bigger story is about how nations protect the hidden infrastructure that keeps their economies alive, and how far they are willing to go to make sure no single route can be used to pressure them. If you found this video valuable, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. We've got more fascinating stories about global strategy, infrastructure, and the forces shaping the world right now. And here's the big question: as more countries build overlapping energy networks and backup routes, does the world become more resilient? Or do these systems create even more strategic pressure points when tensions rise? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.